I'm going to start with this book. It's called A Self-Made Man, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1849 by Sidney Blumenthal. And it says here in the prologue, the slave. I used to be a slave. The first time Abraham Lincoln spoke openly about his origins was the year he assumed his new identity as a Republican. Until then, he had been remarkably reticent about the facts of his personal life. He was one of the best-known political figures in Illinois, yet he kept an essential part of himself mysterious. By 1856, he had been a professional politician on public view for 24 years, more than half his lifetime a stalwart member of the Whig Party, and it was as a Whig that he had climbed rapidly in its ranks. Further down in the book on page 3, it said it was at one of those campaign events that the man who had been extraordinarily reluctant about discussing his past, sensitive about his social inferiority, blurted out a startling confession. I used to be a slave, said Lincoln. He did not explain what prompted him to make this incredible statement, why he branded himself as belonging to the most oppressed, stigmatized, and untouchable caste. For worse than being accused of being an abolitionist, Illinois, while a free state, had a draconian black code. Why would Lincoln announce that he was a former slave? The bare facts he did not disclose to his audience were these. Until he was 21 years old, Lincoln's father, his father had rented him out to neighbors, in rural Indiana at a price of 10 to 31 cents a day. Okay, his dad was hustling, his son around, like selling his services, labor. The father collected the son's wages. Lincoln was in effect an indentured servant. Oh, there we go. A slave. An indentured servant, a slave. All right, we've been learning about indentured servitude, right? The true beginning of slavery, so-called slavery. He regarded his semi-literate father as domineering and himself without rights. All right, so his father was treating him almost like a slave. Why? Why would a father do that to a son? Now, we got the same story with supposedly Benjamin Franklin's dad indenturing his son to his oldest brother, who turns out to be his stepbrother. It says, he was treating him like a slave here, without rights. Thomas Lincoln, who had led a harsh and unfair life, wanted his son to learn an honest trade as a laborer, perhaps train as a carpenter like himself, considered formal education a waste of time, and sought to suppress any larger ambition as useless dreaminess. It was only when the self-made man finally identified himself as a Republican that he felt free to reveal himself as a slave. All right, and then Lincoln completed his story. And now I am so free that they let me practice law. I'm even a lawyer, and I'm what? What does he mean by all this? Why wouldn't he be able to practice law? Lincoln's wry humor drove home his point about his getaway, but masked the scar. Calling himself a slave was not a slip of the tongue, hyperbole, or metaphor. It was not just another of his funny stories. Though he made it into a joke, he truly considered himself to have been held in bondage and escaped. All right, Lincoln literally, if ever, talked about his feelings, even to his closest friends who tried to discern the signs. He hid his depths behind his simplicity. His authenticity was not deceptive, but a veneer nonetheless. He was simple in his dress, manners, simple in his approach and his presence, recalled Herndon. Though this be true, he was a man of quite infinite silences and was thoroughly and deeply secretive, uncommunicative, and close-minded as to his plans, wishes, hopes, and fears. I venture to say that he never wholly opened himself to mortal creature. It was no wonder his captivity as a boy he felt was humiliating. All right, so his captivity as a boy, he was an indentured servant all his young youth, was humiliating and degrading. Imprisonment in a world of neglect, poverty, fleckleness, and ignorance. It was at the root of his fierce desire to rise. If he was angry with his father, he also knew that his father had been reduced to a dirt farmer and compelled to flee Kentucky to escape from slavery. Boom. So his dad was also a runaway. His dad, Thomas Lincoln, was also a runaway at some point. He was escaping from slavery, it says here. Slave states are places for poor white people to remove from. This is where all these runaway, indentured, poor white people were going to. Not to remove to, Lincoln said in 1854 in opposition to Douglas' Nebraska Act. New free states are the places for poor people to go to and better their condition. Lincoln had been oppressed by a man who himself was oppressed. By crossing the Ohio River into Indiana, his father had made his own escape. Lincoln was a fugitive son and a fugitive himself, all right? Lincoln was a indentured servant, and he had escaped at one point in his life. He was a runaway, and look what he did as well, just like Benjamin Franklin, right? Even more startling from Lincoln's self-description as chattel was his subsequent self-identification as a particular kind of slave, a fugitive slave, a runaway. All right, a runaway. He himself is saying that in one of only two brief autobiographical interviews he ever granted, this one intended for circulation in support of his Senate candidacy in 1858 and given to his friend Jesse W. Fell, an Illinois lawyer and businessman who had advised him to challenge Douglas to debate Lincoln, offered this physical description of himself. If any personal description of me is thought desirable, it may be said I am in height 6 feet 4 inches, nearly lean in flesh, weighing on average 180 pounds, dark complexion, again, dark complexion. Remember, this guy is letting us know that this is what Lincoln said about himself. All right, he said he is dark complexion with coarse black hair and gray eyes, no other marks or brands recollected. Many perhaps even at that time might have missed Lincoln's allusion at the end of his seemingly bland self-portrayal, though the politician and lawyer who had learned to wield words with surgical precision certainly knew his own intent and had undoubtedly ruminated on it. No other marks or brands recollected was not another of his amusing jokes, but the exact language slave owners used to describe runaway slaves in newspaper ads. All right? So look, this guy is pointing out what he said at the end, right, about him saying no other marks or brands recollected. But that's very interesting as well, you see. So we know the slave ads actually did have that. I've shown some of them, and they do say things like that: no other marks or brands recollected, meaning the owner who puts out the ad saying, well, he doesn't have a scar, he doesn't have a birthmark, so he would put it there. So that's what he was saying. So it's the exact language slave owners used to describe runaway slaves in the newspaper ads. Lincoln had therefore identified himself not only as one of the fugitives, but also mocked their owners. This was one more than sympathetic projection. He believed he had his own fugitive experience and emancipated himself. He was an oppressed and stunted boy who achieved his freedom. If with his disadvantages he could do it, it could be done. When he became a Republican and identified himself as a slave, he had begun emerging as the Abraham Lincoln identifiable in history. 4 years later, at the Illinois State Republican Convention nominating him for president, he would be given another identity, the rail splitter, the legendary axe-wielding laborer, common man of the people. All right, so this is the story they told us, that he was a laborer. He did the American dream, right? He worked hard and he accomplished the American dream and he became a president. And they gave us this, image of him being a rail splitter, a legendary axe-wielding laborer. But he was really an indentured servant runaway, a slave. That's what he was. Common man of the people, yeah. Establishing one of the most enduring icons in American history. They created what? An icon. Iconoclasm, icon. Though to the private Lincoln, who chuckled at the contrived image making by party handlers, it was a picture of himself from the time when he thought of himself as a slave. Like other runaways, he had remade his identity and never took it for granted. All right? Now, what does that mean? Is that being very subliminal? He remade his image? What does that mean? Why is it saying he's dark complexion here? Why are we seeing a white, pale-faced man? This doesn't look like a dark complexion man. Does this look like a dark complexion man to you? Huh? You know, so they're saying that even himself saying that they were making, he contrived and chuckled about the image making. They were making images of him. In this book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, Volume 1, Michael Burlingame. This chapter is basically about Lincoln also, describing himself as a slave. Just wanted to get you another source. It says here, I used to be a slave, boyhood and adolescence in Indiana, 1816-1830. This quasi-slavery as a rented laborer. As well as a bachelor, Lincoln was also busy. He worked not only on his father's farm, but also for neighbors to whom his father sold him, rented him, indentured him. Around 1825, Thomas Lincoln found himself in greater financial trouble than usual when a friend defaulted on a loan that Thomas had endorsed. To pay off that note, Thomas removed his son from school and hired him out to neighbors, including Thomas Turnham, Wesley Hall, William Wood, Silas Richardson, Joseph Gentry, John Dutton, John Jones, and Joshua Crawford. They all had him as indentured servant. For the next few years, Lincoln was a virtual slave. He was what? A virtual what? Slave. He was a slave, toiling as a butcher, ferry operator, riverman, store clerk, farmhand, woodchopper, distiller, and sawyer, earning anywhere from 10 cents to 31 cents a day. All right, and here's the sources. Meager wages he handed over to Thomas, in compliance with the law stipulating that children were the property of their father, and that any money they earned belonged to him. Locked in this bondage, Abraham felt as if he were a chattel on a southern plantation. I used to be a slave, he declared in 1856. Years earlier, describing his joy at escaping from engagement to be married, he said, through life I have been in no bondage, real or imaginary, from the thraldom of which I so much desired to be free. Thanks to his father, he knew what it was like to be in bondage. This painful experience led him to identify with the slaves and to denounce the South's peculiar institution, even when it was politically risky to do so. So before we